This is the happiest I've been all week. Oh my gosh! Hello and welcome to this episode of Bake It Up a Notch. I'm Erin Jeanne McDowell and I am especially excited for today's episode because the request for it came from so many of you watching. I have heard so many times throughout my career that people are scared of frying. And my goal with today's episode, which I'm calling Frying 101, is really to get all those fears taken care of for you. In fact, in this episode, we are going to be covering 3 different recipes. One easy, one a little bit more medium, and one that's a little bit more difficult. We'll be making Frybread, homemade churros, and my incredible summer favorite donut, the peach fritter. As always in this episode, we're gonna show you where things could go wrong and how to fix it. So without further ado, let's get frying. This Frybread I'm going to make is more the type that is derived from indigenous tribes. Frybread was something that was created when indigenous communities were forced onto reservations, taken away a lot of their native crops, and instead given processed foods like lard and white flour. I learned how to make Frybread after eating it for years at the Haskell Indian Arts Festival, which takes place at Haskell Indian Nations University in my hometown of Lawrence, Kansas. It's an incredible place, and this art festival happened every year with a whole array of food stands, and my dad and I would go just to get Frybread or Frybread tacos, and it really was love at first bite. The best part about this kind of Frybread is that it is not made with yeast. Instead, it's made with chemical leavener, a little bit of baking powder. That means it's very quick and easy to make the dough. Also, the dough doesn't require a lot of rest time. So this is a very easy and quick project from start to finish. Now, I like to make my Frybread dough in the stand mixer. That's because I'm a baker. I've got 2 stand mixers at the ready at all times, but you can absolutely make this by hand. And in fact, when I first started making it, I only made it by hand, just in a large bowl mixing. I'm gonna start with some all-purpose flour that I'm gonna put into my mixer bowl. I'm also going to add my baking powder. Gonna mix those together for just a moment to combine. Now we're going to add some melted fat. Now this fat can be butter, it can be lard, which is what I'm using today. It can really be anything you want, and the idea is that it's melted so that when we add it, it's going to kind of get dispersed throughout. This is not flakiness that we're going for, we're really just looking for even distribution of that fat throughout. It's gonna help to make the Frybread tender, it's gonna help with browning, and help that outside crisp up really nice. I'm gonna mix that fat in for just a little bit of time, just kind of until it's distributed and comes together. Maybe I'll give it a little scrape to encourage some of the flour to go into it, but it's not gonna be enough to bring this dough together. I'm going to need to add water. That's where this comes in. We're gonna mix the dough on medium speed for about 2 to 3 minutes until it comes together, forming a fairly smooth dough. If you're mixing by hand, it's gonna take more like 4 to 6 minutes. Okay, one of the ways you can tell that it's done is it sort of forms the dough around the dough hook. The same thing would happen if you were mixing it by hand with whatever your stirring utensil is. When it starts to sort of pick up everything from the bowl and form around, that's enough mixing time. So as you can see, it's pretty much on there in one big piece. I'm gonna scrape it off. I'm gonna transfer it to a piece of plastic wrap and I'm gonna wrap it tightly. I just wanna let it rest for not too long, just about 15 minutes, just because we've been mixing it, and that gives us enough time to start heating up our oil and preparing our frying station. It's always important to get your frying station ready before your ingredient that you're gonna fry is. So in this case, while our dough is resting, I'm gonna start heating the oil. And this is an opportunity to talk about what a frying station should have. This is our easiest, simplest recipe, so what we need is very simple. For one thing, I am using more of an actual frying pan. I would say 2.5 inches deep. It's not a very deep pan. What we're making is a fairly flat bread, so I don't need a pot that has a lot of deep layers of oil. I really just need a wider surface area and a smaller amount of oil. And I think this is one of the things that's the most intimidating about frying for people is how much oil you need to use. So in this case, we only need 1 to 2 inches of oil to fry this in. We really don't need very much. This is still considered a deep fry and not a pan fry because we're using enough oil that when we first put the fry bread in, it is going to sink to the bottom. While the oil is heating, get the rest of your station ready. What I've got here is a baking sheet lined with several layers of absorbent paper towels, and I also put a wire rack on top. This is going to be kind of my landing pad where the fried foods are going to drain. For this recipe, I'm going to use tongs to take the dough in and out. Other times you might need things like a slotted spoon, or later in this episode, we're going to use a spider, which is a great, great tool for frying. Now, I also think that frying can be scary because everyone is always concerned about these precise temperatures. And of course, as a baker, I'm a big fan of thermometers. They always tell me exactly what I need to know. But of course, it is possible to fry without even owning a thermometer. So for this first recipe, I'm going to test the frying oil to see if it's ready with a scrap piece of dough before I start, just to show you what I'm looking for to see if the oil is hot enough or to see if it's too hot. Later on in this episode, I'm going to talk about different ways to use thermometers and how to prepare your oil, but I just really want to start by making this as unintimidating as possible. You don't really need much, you just need a good eye and to know what you're looking for. Okay, before I start shaping, I'm just going to take a little piece off, and I want it to be similar in thickness to what I'm going to be using, which is going to be about 1/4 inch thick. So I'm just going to smush it down with my hands. I'm not really worried about the size or shape, and I'm going to add it to the oil. Now, the first thing I want to see when I drop it into the oil is it should immediately begin to sizzle or bubble on the surface. Then when I drop it in, it should sink to the bottom and then slowly after a moment or two, rise to the top. Let's start dividing our fry bread dough. We're trying to get 12 even pieces of dough. Because I have zero chill, I have provided a gram reference weight for those of you who want to weigh them out evenly, but it's totally fine to eyeball because these are going to vary a little bit in exact shape and size no matter what. Now I'm going to take each piece of dough and gently round it into a ball. To do this, I usually start by folding the edges over onto themselves a few times. Then I turn it upside down and I use this part of my hand, sort of the heel and palm portion of my hand, to sort of apply pressure, which helps tighten that round a little bit. We talk about this more in our dinner rolls episode of Bake It Up a Notch, so check that out if you want to know more about shaping individual rounds. Once all the pieces of dough have been rounded, we'll work with one at a time. Have some flour handy in case you need to lightly flour your work surface, but only use as much as you need. If there's a lot of excess flour on the outside of the dough when you add it to the fryer, that is usually going to fall off the dough immediately and kind of fall to the base of the fryer and start to cook or even burn there. So we just don't want to use any more flour than we have to. I'm going to start by just pressing it a little bit into a round. And we don't really need a precise round shape here. We're really more focused on the thickness. So I'm just going to roll this out a few times. I'm trying to keep it roughly round in shape, but truly, if it ends up a little oblong, a little funky, trust me, in the end, when you are eating this fry bread, you are not going to care one bit. Now, one last thing we do when we shape the fry bread dough. We go ahead, it's very technical, you just stick your finger through the center. And the reason that we do that is it's giving the fry bread a place for some of the steam that's going to accumulate to vent out. It helps keep it a little bit flatter. It is going to be puffy and bubbly. If we don't put the hole in, it has a tendency to form like one big bubble, and we don't want that. So I'm just going to keep shaping these, working with one at a time, and then setting them aside on my work surface until I'm ready to fry. All right, I've got my first few shaped. I'm going to go ahead and drop them into the oil since it's ready, and I'll keep shaping while they fry. Fry the dough until it is golden brown and crisp on both sides, 2 to 4 minutes per side. I can't wait to take a bite of this fry bread, but first I want to take an opportunity to show you something that's important in frying. Sometimes the top surface will get golden brown and the bottom surface will get golden brown, but you'll have kind of a ring that is paler. People sometimes think that's a mistake. It's not. It's actually a sign that your frying oil was at the right temperature so that the item rose above the oil and it fried where it was touching the oil. Then when you flipped it, it fried on the other side, but it rose so beautifully that in that one spot, there was always like a little bit kind of hovering right above the oil, so it just doesn't brown quite as much. So I'm gonna go ahead and tear into this. Oh, so tender, so fluffy. Look at that. Gonna grab a piece. And right here I've got a little bit of queso. My mom brought me a few big jars of her salsa. I added some cheese to it just for the sake of tasting it with this fry bread. The fry bread is good all on its own. You can also do what my parents do, and they save some of the fry bread to eat in savory ways, and then they finish some with powdered sugar or cinnamon sugar and give it kind of as a dessert twist in the same day. There are so many great ways to enjoy this. In my book, Savory Baking, I top it with some kind of meat or beans and lots of different kind of toppings and make them as fry bread tacos. But even all on their own, you just can't get any better than this. Okay, let's get on to our next frying project. Let's move on to our next frying project, which is a little bit more advanced, but primarily only because of its particular shaping method, which is going to be a piping technique. But luckily, we are going back to one of the very first subjects we ever covered on Bake It Up a Notch, pâte à choux. I know you want to know more about pâte à choux. There's a whole episode about it. You should go watch it. It's amazing. Pâte à choux 101. This recipe is for churros, and the pâte à choux method is exactly the same as we cover in that pâte à choux episode. The only thing that's different is a little bit of ratio adjustments, and mostly that comes down to the flavor. I've added a little sugar, some cinnamon, and some vanilla bean right into the pâte à choux, and I also formulated it to be slightly thicker just to make it easier to pipe and for it to keep its shape while it's frying. But otherwise, you're gonna follow that same method, and once you make your pâte à choux, you're gonna transfer it to a piping bag that's fitted with a large star tip. You're looking for a tip that is about 3/4 of an inch wide, such as a Teco 829, which is an open star tip, or 869, which is a French star tip with a little bit more ridges. It doesn't have to be exactly 3/4 of an inch, but that's kind of about the size we're going for these churros today. Not all of the pâte à choux from this batch fits into the piping bag at once, so I also have my mixer bowl here with a little bit more pâte à choux. Now I've got a couple baking sheets here, and I've made room in my freezer for one baking sheet. That's the first thing we want to do because we are going to freeze these churros, not for very long, but it just helps them to really retain that shape. And the bonus benefit is that when you freeze them, when they fry up, they're crisp on the outside and they stay sort of custardy and super soft on the inside. It is so delicious. The other thing that we have before we get started is a little stack of squares of parchment that are about 5 inches wide. They actually sell these. They're sometimes called deli sheets. Just make sure they're not wax paper because we are going to potentially fry on these later. If you only have wax paper, that's fine too. You're just gonna wanna freeze your churros a little bit longer so that they're firm so you can peel them off that wax paper because wax paper doesn't necessarily like to go in the fryer, but parchment paper can. So what we're going to do is we're gonna work with one square at a time to pipe our churros. I have nearby also a pair of scissors. You'll see why in a moment. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hold my piping bag almost parallel to my work surface. And I'm going to start applying pressure up here. I'm holding the parchment underneath to keep it steady. And I'm just applying even pressure as I work in a diagonal line from one corner of the parchment to the other. When I get to the other end of the parchment, I'm going to stop applying pressure up here, and I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to snip for a clean end point of the churro. Now, oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful already. I'll transfer it to my baking sheet because later we're gonna transfer it to the freezer. So let's pipe a few more and then we'll get our first tray into the freezer. When you freeze the churros, they only actually need about 15 minutes to help them hold their shape in the fryer. But you can freeze them longer, up to 24 hours or even for several weeks in an airtight container. I love this because it's something you can do ahead and then just fry when you're ready. When we fry these churros, we're gonna wanna have our cinnamon sugar ready. So I'm gonna go ahead and mix that now. And I'm also going to make a simple chocolate sauce, sort of a ganache, but a little bit bit sweeter, so almost bordering on fudge, so that we can dip the churros in it later. I can't wait. While the churros are chilling, we can set up our frying station and we can start to heat our frying oil. Since churros are sort of thin in shape, they fry pretty easily and quickly, and you don't necessarily need a deep amount of oil. But this is a good opportunity to talk about how much oil to use and the size of the pot that you're using. Because remember, when you use a smaller pot, you will use less oil. Love that, but you'll also be able to fry less items at a time, which means it's going to take you a longer total period of frying, and by the time you're done, some of those early ones might not be hot and crisp anymore. So it just sort of depends what you're going for. If you're hoping to bring all of an item to the table all at one time, get a bigger pot and just plan on using extra oil. But say maybe you're frying at a party and you kind of can just fry a few at a time and people can pick them up and enjoy until the next batch is ready, you can use a much smaller pot. So it's really up to you. Today I'm using a larger one, so I'll be able to fry maybe 3 to 4 churros at a time in this. In a smaller pot, I'd probably only be able to fry 1 to 2 at a time. For this recipe, I want about 2 to 3 inches of oil to fry the churros in. And I'm going to check with an instant read thermometer. I like being able to put that instant read thermometer in at an angle just to really get an accurate temperature kind of deep in the oil. But do be careful because again, your hand is quite close to the hot pan and the hot oil. I'm aiming for a temperature of around 330 degrees Fahrenheit to start, and then I'm looking to maintain a temperature closer to 320 degrees Fahrenheit when I'm frying. But when we add those first churros, especially cold from the freezer, they're gonna drop that oil temp. So I wanna make sure I get it a little hotter to start. I've also got my wire rack set over a baking sheet lined with some absorbent paper towels, and I have my prepared cinnamon sugar standing by, ready to dip those churros in while they're still warm. That's the way it's going to stick the best. Okay, once my oil is up to temp, I'm gonna grab those churros from the freezer and let's get frying. Sometimes recipes that involve piping fried items are piped directly onto the parchment paper so that you can use that to transfer it to the frying oil without risk of ruining the design. Even though these have been in the freezer and they are mostly firm to the touch, they aren't gonna peel fully off of this paper. See how they're still sticking to the paper? If they were fully frozen, you could peel them totally off. But since they're not, I'm going to fry them right with the parchment paper. As soon as they start to fry, they're going to naturally release from the paper and I can just use tongs to pull it out. At first, the churros are going to sink. As they get closer to being done, they'll float to the surface, and that's when I can really pull that parchment paper right on out. I'm gonna use tongs to handle the churros while they're frying, help them flip over, and in general, I wanna try to keep the ridged side facing down as much as possible because that's sort of the presentation side. The flat side that was touching the parchment paper, it may even start to kind of form a seam or open up a little bit as the churros fry, but don't worry, it's not a problem, it's not a mistake, it's just sort of what happens when you have one really nice looking side and one side that was at one point flat on a pan. Okay, so this is sort of the color I want to see in the final churro. I want a nice even golden brown. Some of the ridges are slightly paler in between. I'm gonna go ahead and use my tongs. I'll give it a little bit of a drain and I'll set it on the pan. I've got 3 that are done right now. I'm just gonna set all those out. Gonna drop a few more in just because I wanna keep this frying train moving. And then I'm gonna toss the ones that I just took out in cinnamon and sugar. This will give it just enough time for them to cool a little bit to be easier to handle, but they'll still be warm enough that that sugar is going to stick really easily. I mixed my cinnamon sugar in a different bowl, but I ended up transferring it to this more shallow bowl just because it makes it easier to coat the churros very quickly while they're still warm. Ooh, those are looking so good. I mean, honestly, I don't even think I can wait until these last ones are finished to try one. And it's my show, so we're just gonna do it. We're just gonna eat one. Which one is my churro baby? I needed one pure unadulterated bite before I chocolated it up, but look what I'm talking about. That center is like almost custardy, and then the outside is so crisp and delicious. I'm gonna dip this other end into the chocolate. I just definitely forgot where I was for a second. I was just in churro heaven. Oh my gosh. Honestly, I'm a chocolate fiend, and this doesn't even need chocolate, it's that good. But that combination of that cinnamon sugar and the chocolate, that crisp exterior, the custardy inside. Let's fry something else. Let's get started on our most advanced frying project, my fruit fritters. Now this recipe is really only tricky because we're working with a yeasted dough. And this particular shape of donut is actually very, very easy to make, but it relies on proper proofing to help the donut keep its shape. You're gonna understand why as we start making it. So I'm gonna start by chopping all of my peaches. I want kind of a classic dice. My recipe calls for 3 large peaches, and so if you're using something that's a little bit smaller, like if you decide to make this with plums or nectarines and they're just a little on the smaller side, you might need more like 4, because we definitely want to make sure we have plenty of peaches. All right, we're done with this cutting board. I'm just going to move it aside and set up my area for rolling out my donut dough. This recipe starts with my favorite donut dough, which I've talked about here on Food 52 before. In fact, it was one of my very first videos that I ever did here on Food 52. And the recipe has been on the website for a really long time. It's truly one of my favorites. It was actually passed down to me by my great-great-grandma. We're gonna use that dough as the base for this fritter. It's a really light and fluffy, rich, yummy dough enriched with things like milk, eggs, butter. It's delicious. All right, let's roll out our donut dough, and we are actually just going to roll this out about 1/2 inch thick. The thing about donut dough is you actually don't always even have to roll it out. This is a pretty big amount of dough, so we'll roll it out. But you can often just kind of pat it out with your hands. So I just bring that up especially for people who are kind of intimidated by rolling. This is one time where, like, if the pin bothers you, your hands are gonna do the trick, because it really is okay if they're even kind of a varied thickness. So see what I mean? I'm just patting it out, and I'm already getting it. It's probably already like 1 inch thick, so I'm not gonna have to pat it out that much more. I do kind of want it to have a rectangular shape, and I wanna make sure it doesn't stick. So I'm just gonna use my hands before I even go to roll it out or pat it out anymore. I'm just gonna kind of stretch it into that rectangular shape I crave. This dough is pretty good at moving wherever you want it to move, so don't be afraid to say, hey, come on, behave. Go where I want you to go, donut dough. Okay, so our dough is looking really nice. It is about the thickness that I wanted, so I'm just gonna start going down and cutting it into 1/2 inch wide strips. And again, it's okay that they're not perfect. Now, I'm just gonna cut it into little cubes. This recipe is gonna make about 12 fritters. So what I wanna do is just sort of visually divide these into 12 even portions on my work surface. So you can kind of even divvy them in half and then make yourself 3 little sections. And then make each of those sections. Why am I always describing the way I do it? I just think it's so helpful to give yourself a visual with stuff like this. 12. Now I just gotta check and make sure that some aren't too skimpy. Nope, those are all looking nice. Here comes the fun part. Well, it's all been fun, really, but it's about to get more fun. I'm gonna take about 2/3 of the dough in my hand and kind of squish the pieces together, but however, let the donut's cubes fall where they may, okay? Then I'm going to grab a few peaches and I'm going to press them really firmly into the dough. Then I'm gonna grab the rest of the dough from that portion and press it on top. And it won't be perfect. Some peaches are gonna come through in some places. We don't want it to be perfect. As you assemble the fritters, you can transfer them to a parchment-lined baking sheet that is lightly floured. This is just gonna help prevent them from sticking before we go to transfer them to the fryer later. Because at this point, these fritters need to proof a little bit, and proofing is gonna help the dough expand. It's gonna help it fully encase some of those peaches, and it's gonna help them stick together better when we fry them. I'm gonna put these in a nice warm place, just covered with a clean kitchen towel. You can also cover them with greased plastic wrap, and we're gonna let them rise for about 20 to 30 minutes. While our fritters rise, let's talk about the frying setup for these. I mentioned that this is our most advanced frying technique because we're gonna do a real deep fry sort of scenario here. Already in this episode, we've talked about how I think a lot of people get scared of frying just because of the quantity of oil. But I did want to show one thing that uses a larger quantity, specifically because it allows you to fry things more evenly and it allows you to fry more things at once. So there is an advantage to doing that, you know, if you're really frying a lot or if you're having a lot of people over and you're frying something up. So this is going to be kind of our classic deep fry setup. We've got plenty of oil in a deep pot. I've fitted it with a deep fry thermometer. You can also, if you don't have a deep fry thermometer, keep an instant read thermometer, but just be very careful when you use that because again, you are getting your hand close to the hot pot, the hot oil. Just be careful when you're checking it with an instant read. Right now, my oil is almost up to temp. I want to get this oil to 350 degrees Fahrenheit with the intent that I really want to fry these fritters more at 340 degrees Fahrenheit. It's always a good idea to get the oil a little bit hotter than your ideal frying temperature because when you start adding things to the hot oil, it's immediately going to drop the temperature. So as soon as we put a few fritters in here to start frying, the temperature is going to plummet. So if we get it 10 degrees higher, it's going to help combat that right out of the gate. There's a few visual cues that tell me these peach fritters have proofed enough. One is that some of the pieces that weren't touching before are now touching because they've kind of grown together and expanded as the dough started to rise. And the other way is that they're just visibly puffy. When I touch it, it springs back a little bit, just in a different way than when the dough was sticky and fresh when I was just handling it. What I like to do first is usually start with my least favorite fritter. And I'm sorry, I love you all, but you are my least favorite. You just don't have the prettiest texture. So I'm gonna start by frying that one because just in case there is something wrong with the oil, then this can be my good tester. I'm just gonna gently lower it in with my hands. If that makes you nervous to get too close to the oil, I understand. It's really wonderful to have a tool like this. This is called a spider or anything that you have that's kind of slotted. I have a few different kinds. This is looking really good. One of the things when you're frying something that is bigger and thicker like this, we really want to make sure that the dough gets cooked all the way through. We don't want to bite into this and have the center be raw, soft dough. So one of the first things I look for when I first add the donut in is that I actually don't want to see it browning a bunch immediately because that's a sign that it's going to brown too fast and I'm going to end up with a donut that looks like it's done on the outside, but that fritter is going to be absolutely raw on the inside. So this is working perfectly. It did not start browning right away. And just now, after several moments of talking to you, it's starting to brown a little bit at the edge. Once you start to see a really nice, even golden brown on one side, then you know it's time to gently flip. The other thing that can happen with these peach fritters is a peach can kind of go rogue. It can break free from its fritter friends and it can sink to the bottom. This is a little bit tricky if it happens only because the peach has a lot of moisture in it and obviously moisture in frying oil, it's not our best friend. So if you ever notice that, just take your slotted spoon, your spider, whatever you're using, and try to get that peach out. You can just set it on your draining tray. That way you're not gonna end up with a peach or any kind of liquid that's gonna spatter at you. While your donuts are frying, you can whisk together your glaze. This glaze is super easy and I flavor it with honey and a little bit of cinnamon. These are looking really beautiful. I've kind of just lifted them up to check if they're browning well on the other side, and they're looking great. So I'm just gonna use my spider to lift them out and I'm kind of gonna hang it over the oil for a few seconds to let any excess fall off. Then I will just transfer it to my frying station. I've got a few layers of absorbent paper towels and then I have a wire rack on top, just to make sure we really help drain any excess oil off of these fritters. Now, this recipe is actually a really good one to use to talk about mistakes that can happen when you are frying. So there's really two major mistakes that can happen that are the biggest concern, and that is your frying oil temperature being off. So since I've just removed some of the fritters from the oil, I'm gonna check the temperature. Okay, my temperature is pretty high. I'm gonna go ahead and knock it up My induction burner will heat this up very, very quickly. And when the temperature gets a little bit higher, we're gonna drop some of the fritters in and we're gonna watch how quickly they start to brown. Again, this is really deceptive because your fritters can look amazing from the outside, but be totally raw on the inside. And this can happen for any of the recipes in this episode, for your churros, for your fry bread, or anything else you could be frying. So it's really important that you're watching that temperature. I'm gonna go ahead, my oil is really, really hot. I'm gonna go ahead and drop one of the fritters in. The first thing that happened, when we fried some of the other fritters, they sunk to the bottom for a moment, then they started to float to the top. This fritter immediately floated. That is one indicator of how hot that oil is. Even the weight of that dough and all those peaches was not enough to sink it even for a moment. And remember, we're dealing with something quite thick here. So we want to make sure that we're not just cooking that outside, we want to make sure it's getting cooked all the way through. That's why a lower temperature is important. On the other side, when the oil is too cold, it has a tendency to not brown, and also the item you're frying will start to absorb some of that oil because it's not hot enough to really be doing the job of cooking. So instead, especially something kind of porous like a dough has a tendency to absorb it. And if you've ever had something fried, when you bite into it and it's kind of greasy, that usually means the oil was not hot enough. This last little thing I want to talk about in the mistakes happen section isn't really a mistake, but it's just something I want to do to kind of encourage you to think that frying isn't as scary. So I think a lot of people don't want to fry because they think, oh my gosh, this is so much oil, how wasteful. And I really, really understand that. But you have to remember that it is actually totally okay to reuse frying oil, especially in baking applications. Now, if you were frying things like seafood or meat, then there are kind of other concerns when you're frying savory stuff like that. But in the case of sweets and baked goods, this oil stays very clean. And actually, frying oil has a tendency to brown things better and more evenly when it's used a second and third time. So to store frying oil, the first thing you're gonna wanna do is cool it down completely in the pot that you were frying in. Don't try to move it when it is hot at all. That could injure you. It could make a mess in your kitchen. We don't want any of those problems. I usually just put a lid on the pot, put it towards the back of my stove, and let it sit there overnight. Then the next day, I would use my spider or a strainer to help me remove any visible chunks or pieces that I see. If there really aren't any, you can go ahead and just transfer your oil to a storage container. And some of those impurities, like little bits of flour that may have browned and dropped to the bottom, some of those impurities have a tendency to stay weighted at the bottom of the oil. So as you're straining the oil, you can also just sort of avoid pouring those last little bits in. What I do is I store it in an airtight container and I label it fry oil, and I also write the number of times it's been used, just for my reference, because eventually after 4 or 5 times of frying, you are gonna wanna discard that oil. But you can really get a lot of use out of 1 round of fry oil. So I don't want people to think it's wasteful, and I don't want all this oil to stop you from making delicious fried things in your own kitchen. These fritters will fry for about 2 to 3 minutes per side, and then you can let them cool for a few minutes before you glaze them, or you can opt to glaze them warm. Glazing them warm is going to cause the glaze to run more evenly over the surface, more like a classic glazed donut all over coverage situation. Letting them cool a little bit can allow you to achieve glaze effects like a drizzle or something that's a little bit more visible if you want it to look more like an icing than a glaze. Also, how much of the liquid you use in the glaze will affect this. I made this glaze pretty thin today because I'm kind of into the all over coverage for these fritters. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Bake It Up a Notch, where we talked about all things frying. We made 3 incredibly delicious recipes, 1 super easy, we didn't even use a thermometer, and then we got a little more advanced as we went through, and of course we showed you where things could go wrong, and I hope I gave you some troubleshooting tips. As always, the recipes we used in this episode are linked in the video description below, so head down there to snag them or head to food52.com. And if this episode does inspire you to get frying, please use hashtag #BakeItUpANotch because I love to see what you're making in your own kitchen. We've got a bunch more delicious episodes coming your way, but until next time, I want to say happy frying.